Happy October, everybody, and welcome back to the couch in my apartment. So the month of October is upon us, which means we're coming up to Halloween. Last year I wanted to celebrate the month of October by doing a ranking series and counting down my 31 favorite horror movies from the 1970s, because the 1970s was my favorite decade for horror. And people really seem to like that one, so I wanted to do that again this year. For the month of October, I'm going to be ranking my favorite 1980s horror movies. You're going to get one review every day, and we're going to be counting down from 31 all the way to my number one favorite horror movie from the 1980s. Last year, it was very hard to do that series because, as I said, the 1970s is my favorite decade for horror. The 1980s is, in terms of decades for horror, the 1980s is a very close second to the 1970s for my favorite decade of horror. If anything, the 1980s was even harder for me to rank than the 1970s. Again, the 70s is my favorite decade for horror, and that was really hard for me to do. But the 80s was... 1980s horror movies were what I grew up with. When I first became a horror fan, the first horror movies I watched, the majority of them were from the 1980s. The very first horror movie I ever saw was an 80s horror movie, which we will be seeing on this list. So this was very, very difficult to do. There are so many great, iconic horror movies that came out in the 80s. It was very hard to pick just 31 of them, and it was even harder to put them in some kind of order. I mean, keep in mind, okay, there's only 31 days in October, which means I only have 31 spots open to put movies on this list. As a result of that, there are some great horror movies that did not quite make it on this list. Some underrated horror movies like Halloween 3. Halloween 3 and Halloween 2 are my favorite sequels in the Halloween franchise. Neither one of them made it on this list. Alligator, which is a great creature feature, that did not make it on this list, and it broke my heart to do that. There's a lot of Italian horror movies that didn't make it on this list, and it broke my heart to do that, because you all know I'm a big Italian horror fan. I'm quite fond of the Child's Play franchise, and I'm a huge fan of the Puppet Master franchise. But the first Child's Play movie and the first Puppet Master movie did not make it on this list, mainly because I'm a bigger fan of Child's Play 2 and Puppet Master 2. And those movies came out in the 90s, so they aren't going to be on this list, but next year when I do the 90s, you will definitely see them on that list. And movies like The Toxic Avenger and Aliens did not make it onto the list. Mostly because, like, The Toxic Avenger I see more as a superhero movie. Admittedly, a very gory superhero movie, and it has been adopted into the horror genre, because I don't think any other genre would have The Toxic Avenger. But I still love The Toxic Avenger. I just don't see it as a full-blown horror movie, so it did not make it on this list. If I considered it a horror movie, it would be on here. And Aliens, I've always viewed as more of an action movie. There are people who say that Aliens is more of an action movie, and it's more of a horror movie. I'm one of those people that sees both sides of the arguments. I say, if you think it's a horror movie, you're right. If you think it's a action movie, you're right. I just personally, for me, it leans a little more on the action side of things. That's why Aliens did not make it on this list. I guarantee you, though, if I saw Aliens as a horror movie, it would have been at least in the top 5. If I had done this list 10 years ago, it would have been very, very different, because it would have included mostly slasher movies, and because I used to be a die-hard slasher fan, and I'm still a slasher fan, but as I've gotten older, I find myself liking other genres more than the slasher genre. I still love the slasher genre, but have become more fond of, like, cosmic horror movies, body horror movies, and movies that are a little weirder in terms of the plot. Well, after that long introduction, let's get into the list. So, So at number 31, we have the first Stephen King adaptation on this list, Cujo. This is the first example of having to break my own heart when picking between two movies. It was a choice between Cujo and Christine. I love Christine. I think it is a very, very good horror movie, and if I were to pick the perfect horror movie to show somebody just getting into horror movies, the very first movie I would go with is Christine. I think it's a perfect introduction horror movie. But after thinking about it, I had to go with Cujo, because when it comes to horror movies, I think simplicity works most of the time. There are plenty of complex horror movies that I love and work very well, but I think in terms of making a horror movie scary and suspenseful, simple is the best way to go. And Cujo is the perfect example of how simplicity can make for such a suspenseful, edge-of-your-seat horror movie.
Cujo! Oh my god, you're rabid.
It's not anything really complicated. It's a movie about a Saint Bernard named Cujo that gets bitten by a bat and gets rabies. And then you have this woman, played by Dee Wallace, one of the greatest scream queens in the horror genre. And she and her son are bringing their car into a shop to get it fixed. The car breaks down, and they're trapped inside the car with this rabid Saint Bernard waiting outside. And it's such a simple premise. You have a mother and a son trapped in a car. It's hot, and the elements are against them. It's getting really hot in this car. If they don't get out of this car, they're going to die of exposure. But they can't get out of the car because there's this rabid Saint Bernard that's ready to tear them apart if they so much as step outside of the car. The reason Cujo works so well is Cujo, in a way, is a victim in the movie as well. He's really sick. Before he goes rabid, we see him as this big, fluffy, happy dog. And then he gets bitten by this bat and turns rabid. Cujo isn't really a bad dog. He's sick. He's gone rabid, and rabid animals become very vicious. And then you have Dee Wallace as the mother Donna and her son Tad. Dee Wallace in this movie, Donna, I think is one of the most underrated final girls in horror. Whenever you hear people talk about final girls in horror or ranking underrated final girls in horror, I never see Donna getting brought up. I mean, this woman is doing everything she can to protect her son. You know, you get to the third act of this movie where her son is, like, in legitimate danger of dying. She fights like hell for this kid, and you really feel for her. Some legitimately frightening moments, and a really good jump scare in this movie. One of the best jump scares in horror, because you have Donna, she's trying to get her son out of his seat because the seatbelt is stuck, and the camera's zooming in on this situation, and then all of a sudden the dog pops up in the window.
Oh, I can't get it. Oh.
Something I get a kick out of here is all the different methods they use to try and make it look like this dog is really a vicious dog. Because on set, it was a bunch of trained dogs. And one of the things they did to try and make this dog seem vicious is they got this plastic mouse and they added some kind of pheromone to it. And the filmmakers put it in the car with the mother and son, and all the dog is trying to do is get its toy. I mean, it looks vicious, it looks like it's trying to get in and kill this family, but it's really just the dog trying to get his toy. And they had to either tie the dog's tail down or just shoot the dog from like the waist up. They could not show its tail because as they're trying to make this dog look vicious, its tail is wagging back and forth with excitement because it's just like, yay, I'm going to get my toy. Makes the movie a little more wholesome behind the scenes.
It's not a monster, it's just a doggy.
I think Cujo deserves a little more love as a Stephen King movie. So, all of you out there, for the Halloween season, if you're in the mood for a Stephen King movie, I encourage you to watch Cujo. It's a realistic horror movie, and it feels like something that could actually happen. Somebody getting attacked by a rabid dog. So, for this Halloween season, I say give Cujo a watch because Cujo deserves more love.